All right. While we're waiting for Commissioner Rosenworcel to be able to join, we'll start here. And first, thanks very much to Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, one of our FCC commissioners, who'll be joining us here this morning. My name's Jane Stankavich, and I head Intel's Global Digital Infrastructure Policy. So I cover our connectivity, 5G and Wi-Fi policies, for example, but now also artificial intelligence, autonomous driving, Internet of Things, and standards policy. So plenty to keep us busy here. And Intel obviously plays a large role in the communication space with everything from going to be the largest network infrastructure silicon provider for 5G, and as well as a long history in Wi-Fi. And joining us today, so far we have Commissioner Mike O'Reilly on. He has plenty of experience both in the U.S. House of Representatives as well as the U.S. Senate, and multiple terms as FCC commissioner, a longtime commissioner with a lot of experience from a lot of different perspectives. And shortly we will be joined by Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, who also has experience in the U.S. Senate and now a multiple term FCC commissioner. But having said that, most importantly, I think both of the commissioners are some of our really, I have had great discussions with them, very thoughtful, different, very passionate about bringing broadband to our societies. And so today we wanted to discuss 21st century broadband policy. So less about specific on this rulemaking versus that rulemaking, and more about how you really approach broadband policy, because last time I checked, we weren't able to grow any spectrum on trees. So we have to make some trade-offs, and how do we implement this and bring some of the new technologies to fruition while still, obviously keeping incumbent services. So we'll start. Commissioner Rosenworcel is having some technical difficulties with access right now, so we'll start with Commissioner O'Reilly, and when Commissioner Rosenworcel joins, we'll catch up midstream. So first, the question of the day always now is COVID. So are there any BKMs or things that you want to share in terms of your perspective, Commissioner O'Reilly, with how you're approaching COVID, or things that we might want to do? And really the goal here is to share some of the high level, big picture thoughts.
Well, thank you for having me, Jane. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Intel, for hosting. The technology is somewhat coming in and out, so I appreciate anyone who's able to be here today. It's a little early on the East Coast and even earlier on the West Coast of the United States. So to answer your question, I think it's two parts. One is just as a father and someone who's raising two little daughters in a house. Handle home, how do you handle that they're not quite at school age, so how do you deal with daycare and just functioning through the technology? Screens can you handle? How much does your bandwidth does your household handle? And then as a regulator, it's a bigger question and a much more challenging question. How do we expand in a short time frame broadband access as quickly as possible, and in some instances patchwork networks to get up and running those people who don't have it, that those that do have that the network is sustainable and doing fairly well. And the good news in the United States is that the internet has as a whole, and our broadband companies have done fairly well in keeping up with the increased traffic. We've seen traffic patterns shift somewhat away from the urban centers and more to the residential areas as people to Washington, D.C. They stay in the suburbs. So that's not surprising. But it matters where your network, strong points are, and it's been relatively when we've been relatively the peak of 30 or 40% at some times, which seems to have been decreasing. Maybe everyone has seen all the Netflix that they want to see, but in all honesty, the network is holding up together pretty well. It doesn't decrease the desire and the need and the demand for my job to try and figure out how do we solve those immediate issues and then the longer term issues.
Well, and that's a perfect segue. So that it does seem longer term, right? That even as there's a little less, things are starting to move here in the United States, and there is, some going back, reopening of some of the cities, etc. But I do think there has been a fundamental shift. I mean, when you talk about the number of screens, I didn't know there were so many screens in my house until until everybody was home. and now they're all often all operational at the same time. So, but I think more importantly, I'm not sure. Like, I think we've hit a fundamental turning point. I think people actually understand how important our digital infrastructure is now, and how much it is a part of our lives. So longer term, do you think there are any implications that we have to think about in terms of broadband as a digital infrastructure as a key part of our society, and needing to make sure that that exists and is widespread and available? Any implications that you've seen?
Well, 2 points. One, congrats to the amazing innovators of Wi-Fi and the work that they've done to expand service. My connectivity in the home comes from broadband to my modem, and then throughout the house. And so they've been able to really handle so many screens in our household. So I appreciate that so much. We just passed World Wi-Fi Day. But to your point, I think it highlights something that I've been pushing for so long, and that is we're going to need a technology neutral approach. That there isn't one solution for every household. And some policymakers would love to have fiber to everybody's home. I just don't think that's sustainable because we have a very very scattered population in some of the more rural parts of America. It's just not economical to take fiber to those areas, and so it's going to require different technology. And so when we make policies at the Commission, we try not to put our finger on the scale of which one is going to be the solution. It gets also to the second point of how much if it's not going to, how much is enough to whether it's the short term or the long term, to bring connectivity to a household. I would love everyone to have as much speed as they possibly can. The technology will allow, but that's probably not economically. And over long term, we're not sure. So if it's something that can be done in a fixed wireless scenario or a satellite scenario, I'm willing to have someone connected at 25.3 versus having a gig. And that there's that policy shakeup. So to your point, what are we learning? The new normal to me is that connectivity is more important than it's something I've written before. Give me a Chevy over a Lamborghini. I need to get more Chevys out there so everybody's connected. We have a good population in the United States that needs assistance, and we're working hard to make that happen. So I want to get as many people on board as soon as possible, and then worry about how do we upgrade as a little bit longer term challenge some of those areas.
And these are issues that regulators around the world are facing, right? Everybody has diverse populations in terms of urban, suburban, rural, different challenges in terms of, industries to bring online, agriculture, et cetera. And how do you, balance all of that? Are there any BKMs that you can think of, or is it, just going to be a patchwork of different approaches? Because everybody struggles with this. How do you really diffuse broadband across the country? Any BKMs are just a patchwork.
I like the BKM, so we're not, we don't tend to use it in our world. We have a lot of acronyms, maybe not that one yet. But to your point, look, it's not a scattered shot. It's not a complete patchwork. But having everything completely coordinated is probably a little bit a high ask, right? Certainly in the short term, and over the longer term, it's going to require a lot more cooperation among different agencies that we have in the U.S. government to deal with the issue. But I look at this and it is how do you get different technologies to those areas, and what points to me, what jumps out to me, and what I see globally is the increasing need and the increasing recognition of what wireless plays and the role that it plays in bringing connectivity. People talk about fiber to the home, and wonderful, and I mentioned that before, but it's really going to be a wireless solution, and I'm really amazed and impressed at the new technology, and we go to 5G and eventually to C, and what those may bring. I've been calling it wireless fiber, wireless broadband, and that's really what it is. And so in many instances, it's going to be wireless or satellite or some other technology that's really going to be ubiquitous and integrate all the technology into one experience is very interchangeable.
Good morning, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Good morning. Sorry, it's early in these parts, and despite the fact that I'm an FCC commissioner, I do occasionally have some technical difficulties. So,
well, it's very early in California too. I can assure you. I was actually thinking about this that without so much travel, finally it's not a red eye. So for the audience, I usually see the commissioners after having been on a red-eye flight overnight, so they see me arriving, tired and bleary-eyed.
No, you look glorious, Jane. Don't worry.
No, but so finally I had a chance to have a discussion where I wasn't tired and bleary-eyed, and it's 4 a.m. So Forum Europe took care of it to make sure that you had the consistent experience. So Commissioner Rosenworcel, welcome. We've already discussed COVID, but for this
solved it
situation.
All. I know, Mike. Really, look at what you've done here before 8 a.m. Our time.
And I really do appreciate the early morning start. So what we're trying to do is have a more high-level discussion. Everybody has, we usually go right into the this technology or that technology or where we are in a different proceeding. But for this discussion, more high level, sort of bigger picture, how do we approach these policy concerns that regulators around the world have? Everybody is in the middle of COVID, and so we have discussed some of the US approaches. But when we think about the long-term implications and moving our societies to more of a digital infrastructure, clearly one of the things that's going to be important is spectrum policy. And I was telling Commissioner O'Reilly earlier that it doesn't appear that spectrum grows on trees. So we need to figure out some ways of moving things forward with spectrum policy. And when we think about this, are there any approaches that you take when you think about, given that we can't grow new spectrum, how do we bring these new technologies to bear? How do we, what are some of the thoughts of best practices or things that you can consider to sort of bring innovative new technologies into, and the FCC has a great history of this, right? But, whether it's voluntary mechanisms or different licensing flexibility, what kind of approaches do you think might make sense, or things to think about for regulators in other countries? And Commissioner Rosenworcel, if you want to go first on this one.
Sure. Yeah. Now that I'm here, I think at a high level, there are certain policies that make us more efficient with those airwaves that we are not, due to the laws of physics, capable of expanding. The first is flexible use policies. There was a time in the United States not that long ago where we would allocate certain bands strictly to a certain type of technology. And by doing that, we got broadcast television, and we've also set aside airwaves for some public safety uses and additional airwaves for efforts to try to make driving safer. But I think what we've learned over time is that if we allocate our airwaves with a mind only towards what's happening right here, right now, we lose out opportunities in the future. So the more that we can allocate our airwaves for flexible use, the more we'll be able to accommodate what's new and innovative in the future. And another part of doing that fast is making sure you have robust secondary markets, because we should make sure that there's opportunities to be able to reallocate those airwaves in the private sector. It will move use cases to places that are more of the moment more rapidly. And then in addition, I think that we need to start figuring out how to have the right mix of licensed and unlicensed airwaves, because one thing that's become apparent in this crisis is we're using a lot of both. And our long-term planning has to be mindful of the fact we need both. And then finally, I think we have to think a lot about how we restructure old allocations. And sometimes in the United States, we try to pressure federal colleagues who have airwaves that are allocated to older uses for important purposes. and we try to claw back some of those airwaves, and it turns into a bit of a fight. I'd like it if we could create a system of incentives so that every spectrum user has an incentive to be efficient and gets opportunities to see gain and not just loss from reallocation. So those are some high-level thoughts about how we can be more efficient, and with that efficiency, put these scarce airwaves to use more rapidly for new innovations and technologies.
Commissioner O'Reilly, do we still have you? I don't see you on the screen right now.
Apparently you only get one of us at a time, but.
Okay, so as you do, if you're a commissioner or a regulator in another country, how would you recommend in terms of any practices or things that to take into account to bring that flexible approach or mindset, right? Like we do talk about flexibility, but are there anything when you think about putting into practice that they should consider, or is it, right? Because we're at a point in time, they have the existing regulations on the book, and then, sort of also moving forward. I
think flexible use is the most important, not allocating new airwaves just for specific purposes. We should think, of course, about harmful interference and figuring out how to make sure adjacent uses can accommodate one another. But I think we have to have a flexible use mindset, because I think that allows the market to repurpose airwaves for the most modern technologies as rapidly as possible.
And you also, Commissioner O'Reilly, if you can hear us, if you want to speak up. Okay, while we're waiting for that, in terms of the voluntary mechanisms, any ideas? So it is an approach that has worked in the United States in some situations, but any ideas, like, are there considerations that you take into account of where, Commissioner O'Reilly? So we actually now have the two commissioners at one time again. Commissioner O'Reilly, did you want to respond on Commissioner Rosenworcel's thoughts on flexible use, or if you were able to hear it, on flexible use and ways to get there, or
sure.
Any thoughts?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I heard parts of it, and I agree with my colleague's points that I heard. I'm sure she made some that I didn't, and I'm probably agree with those as well. We share common thoughts on a lot of these topics. And work closely together on the matter. I think that we've moved past the idea of having specific bands for specific purpose that she outlined so very well, and that just means that there's more demands from every spectrum user. And if the old mechanisms are moving away, and we're going to adopt a much more flexible structure, but it gets to the larger point is how does the commission handle some of the bigger issues? In the United States, we've moved away from, we've tried to provide as much flexibility in terms of the spectrum policy, but then also a lot of flexibility in terms of the build out itself and the fiber policy. All the different components that go into it are not as much regulated as they once were at the FCC. We've stepped away a little bit and provide more certainty to providers so they can get a rate of return, or a return on investment is a better phrase, and so that there's money to be had in a reasonable way. And so that's been very beneficial, and why they've built redundancy in many instances, why they've built wider networks throughout the world. And so I think it's a combination of policies that we've had. Our spectrum policy very advanced, in my opinion. And then we've also had a very forward-leaning approach, for our fiber builds and for our infrastructure build.
Actually, if we could key in on this one area for 1 second. So I do note that one of the things that the U.S. did that was different than I've seen in some of the other countries was with some of the millimeter wave bands to just we've done that as well in the past, but like for some of the 5G millimeter wave bands, take the existing licenses and just add flexibility to them. And that really jump-started things much more than some of the lengthy rulemaking processes that might happen, right? So on average, it takes a long time from start to finish to start with a new proceeding. At least that's my perception of it.
That's totally fair.
This jump starting, it really was a different approach, and I think regulators in other countries have certainly asked about it. So if you want to maybe talk through how you think about when there might be situations where you can just add flexibility to existing licenses, because I do think it's an approach that is one that has a lot of interest in other countries, right? So the millimeter wave, you just took the existing licenses and added some flexibility, and then that jump started things. Commissioner Rosenworcel, any thoughts on that?
I mean, listen, a lot of times if we're going to look at particularly a millimeter wave, you might have some existing uses that might not occupy the full band. So the question is, what tools do you have in your toolkit to bring that to market fast? Things like adding flexible use are helpful. Also, sometimes issuing overlay licenses where you auction it off and then make it the duty of the auction winner to go and accommodate and reorganize the band if there are only a small community of existing users, so they continue to get the functionality they need, but the negotiation doesn't directly happen with the regulator. The regulator just accomplishes that with an overlay license, and the purchaser of that overlay license gets the burden of trying to figure out how to manage some small and discrete uses that may be present. I think you have to recognize these greenfield swaths of spectrum are probably only exist in our imagination, and coming up with smart tools that can rapidly repurpose our airwaves for modern uses. We're going to have to keep thinking about how to do it efficiently. And I think worldwide, we're all going to learn from each other's examples.
Commissioner O'Reilly, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would add to that. And I did a very good job there. I think I would add to that is that we've used flexible use as it relates to existing licensees. How do you put this purpose to be more, flexible? How do you, is built for this size or this geographic area? How can you convert it, transform it? What the existing licensee, what makes them want to do that? We've used market mechanisms to have them trade in their old licenses to get new licenses to handle different things. And so that is really creative thinking by the FCC and the good staff that we have to how do you deal with a situation that's pretty stagnant and you want to get to a very dynamic universe and you've got to deal with incumbents, and rather than forcing them to do one thing, we're basically giving a mechanism so they can participate or they can trade off their licenses or use those almost credits for other things. And so it becomes a very dynamic.
So Commissioner O'Reilly, this brings up a good point, the voluntary nature of it, right? And the U.S. has had some success in voluntary mechanisms. For instance, the 600 megahertz incentive auctions, where we had a situation where otherwise, how long that may have taken, and we ended up instead with a voluntary mechanism. So if you're a regulator in another country, are there any methods or areas where you could say, hey, this one might be ripe for looking at voluntary mechanisms, or how do you approach that from a mindset? So maybe Commissioner O'Reilly, if you want to take the first one at this point on this one.
Sure. Well, I would say that we're also doing C-band licenses auction that's going to be later this year. And in both instances, you had incumbents using basically the full band, and how do you shrink their footprints and do so in a thoughtful way. And the incentives that we came up with, one by the U.S. Congress and the second through the commission mechanism to try and financially provide them the incentive to move through money. But the other case scenarios take somebody who is using the spectrum efficiently and shrink their footprint. They have to provide an incentive, and we have a number of those case scenarios that we're working on, and that becomes a struggle. How do you, if someone's using 3% or 5% of an allocation, how do you shrink their footprint? That doesn't require the financial contributions that we traditionally have, that we've looked at in other places. So there's the two, in my opinion, that if someone is using spectrum that we have identified as incredibly valuable for new purposes and new technology, and they're using it very efficiently, how do we incentivize them to either shrink their footprint or move somewhere else? The other scenarios where you're using it inefficiently, how do we make the tough decisions that we're going to decrease that footprint necessarily against their wishes?
Yeah, I think the real challenge for regulators in this environment is price discovery. In other words, what's fair compensation to relocate or remove existing users? What tools do regulators have to figure out what's the just lawful price to make that happen? That's a proper incentive and justifiable. And I think the best lesson that I take from our efforts in the 600 megahertz band is that having an incentive auction is a really good way to engage in price discovery. I will also acknowledge it's complicated, but it's my hope that we can use that model, not just in the United States again, but actually use it worldwide, because I think it's a very fair, market organized system to develop price discovery. So those who remove at exactly the price that they're willing to do so, and those who purchase at exactly the price they're willing to do so. I think that there's something really elegant about the price discovery in an incentive auction.
So we're almost out of time here, and I do want to give Commissioner Rosenworcel, before you joined, we covered everything from COVID.
Yeah, you said we saw
everybody has, right. But we also had discussed, you know, some of the challenges that we face in terms of rural, urban, suburban, underserved, and were there any BCAMs or best known methods? Sorry, Commissioner O'Reilly. It's an early morning. It's ingrained in me from the industry perspective. So it's one always at the top of the tongue. Commissioner Rosenworcel, any best known methods or practices that you think are things that you take into consideration when you think about you know, sort of the rural or some you know, underserved areas, underserved needs, any you know, everybody has views on it, but it's very challenging to put that together. Any advice or perspectives that you'd like to share on this?
Listen, I know in the United States as a nation, we've been asked to go to school online, work online, conduct commerce online, entertain ourselves online. But what I really think is happening is like we just moved into the future very fast. And our bandwidth demands are real and they're big. And in this moment, what we're starting to do is realize with total and complete clarity who has access, who doesn't, what bandwidth is necessary to accomplish all of these things at home and what's not, and how outages affect our networks. So my greatest hope is that we learn from this moment, because I think we're seeing with more clarity than we've ever had before who gets served, who doesn't, where our networks need to be bolstered, and what changes need to be made. So it is actually my hope that we really make an effort to study what's happening right now in this moment, because I think it's really telling us a lot about what the future of communications needs to look like.
I certainly agree with that. So as we wrap up here, I just wanted to thank both of the commissioners. I do think it's clear that digital infrastructure is a key part of our societies now and going forward, and a challenge that we're all going to have to face in figuring out how to really get the benefits out to all of our members of society. So thanks to Commissioner Rosenworcel, Commissioner O'Reilly for an early morning start. I really do appreciate it. I recognize, you know, especially with you know, working from home and children at home, how challenging that is. So I really do appreciate your time this morning. Any last thoughts? Commissioner O'Reilly, if you want to go first on this, any last thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say thank you so very much, and thank you to Intel for setting this up. If I were to leave with one last thought, it would be certainty. How do you provide certainty to let providers invest and know that they can make an honest living?
And Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Apologies for the late arrival. But I think the thing that we all want to do is get a lot more creative about spectrum reallocation. And if we all get more creative and start looking at what our colleagues are doing worldwide, I think we're going to be a lot better off, because the more airwaves we can push to commercial markets for innovation, I think the more innovation we're going to see.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, and I will see you on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.